Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me as we continue tonight with our next session in our Demystifying series. Tonight, we are going to talk about Olam Haba. What do we actually know about the world to come? I would like to begin with an apology, perhaps for those who like the PowerPoints that I have been using to assist me in these presentations and to accompany whatever words I share with you. Tonight, I do not have a PowerPoint. I am so sorry, but maybe actually that's fitting because we're going to be talking about Olam Haba, a place which requires a lot of imagination. We have to try to fill in the blanks and a lot of empty spaces. And maybe therefore it's fitting that tonight we will not have a PowerPoint. Blineder, I hope to continue to offer them going forward. So tonight we're going to talk about a topic which is really very, very difficult for me to talk about because, to be honest, this may be really the first time, I think, in my entire career that I've actually devoted an entire session to talk about Olam Haba. Of course, and I think this is part of the way I'd like to begin tonight by just acknowledging, of course, we speak about Olam Haba all the time. We refer to it. It comes up in the context of conversations that we're having, certainly Torah-related conversations, drashos, shiurim, and the like, but to actually take a step back and to say, okay, so there is this basic fundamental Jewish perspective that we understand that there is a world which follows this world, that our physical world, which is for the time being our entire experience, is not everything, that there is something beyond this. So this is something that we all assume, that was something that we all know, that we believe. But what exactly it is, what happens when a person dies? Where does the soul go? Does it remain there permanently? How does this change, if at all, during the days of the Mashiach? What exactly is Techiyas HaMesim all about? So see, these are the types of questions that may keep some of us really wondering, in some cases with a real burning curiosity, what this is all about. How can we relate to the concept of a world, a mode of existence that no one has ever been to and then return? We're not going to actually see them tonight, but there are several comments in the Gemara which seem to relate stories of what maybe we would call today like a near-death experience. But for the most part, we don't really know. We don't really know. And I think that is one of the reasons why having such a focused conversation is something which is, on the one hand, very intriguing, very challenging, but it's also just on a certain level, I find this to be difficult because it is so unfamiliar to me in terms of content that I have tried to share in the past. There are many questions that come to mind. And as always, I'll begin with one more disclaimer, and that is that this is such a broad topic. There is so much that we can talk about. So tonight, in our limited time, we're going to be talking about a concept which, by definition, is reflecting a world of infinity. We're going to have to sort of focus a little bit. But I hope to cover tonight, just sort of definitionally, what exactly do we mean when we say Olam Haba? Where in the Torah do we talk about Olam Haba? What happens after death? What does one experience in Olam Haba? And the last thing I want to talk about, why is it that, in fact, we find that the Torah actually says very, very little? We're going to begin by talking about references in the Torah, but why should it be that something that's so basic, so fundamental to our religion, to our worldview, to understanding just on a very foundational level what Torah is about? Why is it that the Torah almost omits it entirely? So let's begin by first acknowledging and citing actually where in the Torah we do find references to Olam Haba. So every one of the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, at the time of his death, the Torah uses, in some cases, overlapping, similar, in some cases, unique expressions to describe death. Vayigva, Vayama, says the Torah, for example, says by Avram. So the Torah says, Vayigva Vayamas Avram, that he expired and he died. B'seva tova zaken v'saveya. He died at a good age, a mature age. He lived a content life. And then the Torah says, Vayeyasef elamav, which we would translate as he was gathered to his people. What exactly does that mean? It clearly doesn't mean that he died, because that's Vayamas. It doesn't mean that he expired, that he sort of ceased living. That's what Vayigva is. So what exactly is this Vayeyasef elamav? We find the same thing by Yitzchak, by Yaakov as well. The Torah tells us, Vayime Yitzchak ma'as shana u'shmachim shmonim shana, he lived 180 years. Vayigva Yitzchak vayamas Vaye Yosef Elamav, gathered to his people. So many of the Mefarshim explain that what's happening over here is a reference to the gathering of the soul. So Misa, death, which is the word that the Torah most typically uses to describe what we call death, when a person physically ceases to live, when a person, as we sometimes say, so whether we understand this literally, metaphorically, the soul leaves the body, becomes separated from the body. So following that, or part of that process, the part that we can't necessarily see and detect using our five senses, is Vayeyasaf Elamav. That rather than say that the soul is lost, that the soul ceases to exist, that it goes and it sort of, it dies together with the body. No, Vayeyasaf Elamav is gathered Elamav to its people. Which people are that? So that would be relatives, tzaddikim, righteous people, others who have since returned or traveled to a place that we call Gan Eden. And we're going to come back to this a little later. But here I'm showing you that in the Torah itself, there are references to what seems to be a description of the afterlife. Vayeh Yosef Alamav. Fast forwarding a lot, but if we take a look in Koheles, Shlomo Melech tells us, V'yashov ha'afar al haaretz, dust returns to the earth, kishahaya, like it was beforehand, v'haruach tashuv el ha'elohim asher nasana, and the spirit returns to God, who gave it in the first place. So here Shlomo Melech is describing, again, almost this sort of this separation, this bifurcation of body and soul, which of course is, by definition, that's what it means to be alive in this world. God created us by fashioning dust of the earth, as the Torah tells us, and then vayipach biyapad nishmas chaim. And the process of separation is one that has the offer returning to the earth, and the ruach tashuv el elokim, which again is describing that it's not the end, but that ruach is going somewhere. Some may be familiar. There's a famous story in Sefer Shmuel, Shmuel Aleph, that after the death of Shmuel Hanavi, and we know that Shmuel died because the pasuk tells us, "Ushmuel meis." Shmuel died. Vayispedu lo kol Yisrael. He was eulogized. Vayikberuhu. He was buried. So we know that Shmuel died. But yet, shortly thereafter, as Shaul HaMelech's life was coming to an end, and he was starting to feel sort of the beginning and the end of his malchus, so he wanted to connect with the soul of Shmuel Hanavi and wanted to ask him what was going on. So oversimplifying things a bit, and now we're not going to talk about the process that he used and whether it's right, whether it's wrong, but the bottom line is he literally goes ahead, as the Navi seems to describe, and summons the soul of Shmuel. And Shmuel communicates with him. Shaul, Lama hirgastani lalososi. Why did you disturb me to raise me up? As if to imply, as if to suggest that Shmuel was resting, like we use this term, right? May he rest in peace. So Shmuel says, listen, I was in a good place. Why have you bothered me? Why have you disturbed me? So here you have, again, biblical sources which do seem to imply, suggest, and maybe explicitly, not only implicitly, that there really is a place where souls go after we leave this world. Chazal seem to assume that some of this is actually almost self-evident from the Torah itself. So, for example, famous pasuk in Parshas Acharei Mos, "Ushmartem es chukosai v'mishpatay asher ya'aseh osam ha'adam." The Torah says that you should observe my chukim, my mishpatim, the mitzvahs of the Torah, that a person should do v'chai bohem. What does that mean, v'chai bohem? A person should do them and live by them. Ani Hashem. So Chazal tell us the Sifra on this pasuk says v'chai bohem l'olam haba. When it says v'chai bohem, meaning if a person lives a life of mitzvahs in this world, v'chai bohem, they will live l'olam haba. And then the Sifra asks on itself, v'im tomar b'olam hazeh, maybe you'll tell me, no, v'chai bohem means in this world. The Torah is saying you should do mitzvahs in this world so you could live in this world. It gives us a chiyus, right? Kehim chayenu v'yarachamenu. It gives us a sense of energy, purpose, meaning. So v'chai bohem means in this world. Says the Sifra, no. Why? Halo sofa mesu. Because we don't really, how long do we really live in this world? The Torah can't be saying, do my chukim mishpatim, everything. Why? So you will live? Our life in this world is very limited. Hamani makayim v'chai bohem. So Chazal said, well, how do we understand v'chai bohem? It must be Olam Haba. In other words, from this source you see that Chazal understood that the Torah itself assumes, takes for granted that there is an afterlife. There are numerous sources in Chazal, some of which we are familiar with, some are very famous, where Chazal clearly cite the existence of multiple worlds, of Olam Hazeh, this world, and Olam Haba, the world to come, as we call it. The Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah says, Lama nivra ha'olam b'beis, We know that the world was created with the, what does it mean, with Beis, with the letter Beis, because Bereshis, the first letter of the Torah, is a Beis. To show us shehin shnei olamim, that there are two worlds, not just one world, two. Ha'olam hazeh, olam haba. So literally, Chazal say the very first letter of the Torah underscores this idea. This world, the next world. Perhaps one of the most famous Makoros that I'll share with you tonight comes from Mishnah Pirkei Avos in the 4th chapter. Rabbi Yaakov Omer, Ha'olam hazeh doma leprosdar. This world is like the prosdar, the lobby, the entranceway. Bifnei Olam haba. Haskein atzmacha beprosdar kedei shetichnas l'traklin. Chazal tell us that Olam haba is like the banquet hall. It's like the place we're going to go to celebrate. And this world is a prosdar. So Chazal use a very powerful and for some of us maybe very motivating sort of metaphor, which really puts all of life into perspective. If you have a great life, if you're loving everything, as everything's just working really well, or if you're finding life really challenging, remember that it's only a prosdar. Or, as some say, not part of this Maimon Chazal, I don't know if it's Maimon Chazal at all, Gamze Yavor. This too shall pass, which is something we should remind ourselves if we're going through really difficult times in life. Gamze Yavor, don't worry, stay with it, this will pass. And if things are going really well and we're really feeling like we're on top of the world, Gamze Yavor, sooner or later, this too shall pass. Ha'olam hazeh, this world is like a prosdar. It's the lobby. Soon we're going to get to the traklin. Another very famous marker, it's a Mishnah in the beginning of Maseches Peah. It is customary to cite this in the morning. There are certain things that when we eat the peros, meaning we benefit on a certain tangible level in this world. V'hakeren, however, the principle, meaning the main benefits that we earn, kayemes lo olam haba. They will be waiting for a person olam haba. In other words, so like we don't burn through the principle. We don't spend the principle. The principle remains. The Karen is kayemes lo olam haba. So Chazal clearly tell us there's olam hazeh and there is olam haba. So just to conclude, in our first opening section of tonight's presentation, we have tried to demonstrate that from the Torah, both the Torah Shebachsav and the Torah Shebapeh, we find that there are very, very clear, explicit references to the existence of Olam Haba. But of course, that leads us to the next question, maybe the most important one of all, and then what is Olam Haba? So Olam Haba is a term which probably includes many, many different places, and I would say periods of time. If Olam Hazeh means this physical world and the world in which we know, the world which exists as long as we are here, so Olam Haba is anything that sort of exists now in another place or after. And it's a term which is a very inclusive term, because Olam Haba may include, and we're going to define this in a moment, Gan Eden. It may include what's sometimes called Olam HaNeshamos. It may include Yemos HaMashiach. It may include Techiyas HaMesim, and perhaps all of eternity, which follows. So Olam Haba is not a specific place or time, as much as it's a very, very broad descriptive term, which describes lots of things which come after, which come next. So the Ramban, which is one of the most often cited sources when it comes to discussing this issue, in the Torah Sa'adam, the Shar HaGemul, so the Ramban basically tells us that there are different stages and phases. When a person dies, they go to a place called the Olam HaNeshamos, which is the world of souls. This stage is what Chazal mean when they refer to Gan Eden. We're not talking about Gan Eden that exists in the beginning of time. I mean, it could be that there are associations over there, but not the Gan Eden that we read about in the beginning of Sefer Bereshis, but Gan Eden we would talk about, that we say that a person's soul should rest in Gan Eden. That is referring to a world of souls. When a person leaves this world, their soul goes to the Olam HaNeshamos, a place called Gan Eden. The second phase of Olam Haba will be a future time, which will begin in the Messianic period. It'd be most of Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, now obviously, Mashiach, when we speak about the coming of Mashiach, we're talking about something that is in this world. It's a physical time, physical state of being. So there will be periods of Techiyas HaMesim. The Ramban actually says there are going to be two separate Techiyas HaMesim, two resurrections. The first one, which will take place immediately after the coming of the Mashiach, so this will only include those who were completely righteous during their lifetime, and they are going to initially rise at the time of Techiyas HaMesim, and then there will be a second resurrection for the rest of mankind that will follow at the end of the period of Mashiach. Of course, this is what we sometimes call the Great Day of Judgment, the Yom HaGadol VaHanora, where God will sort of settle every score of injustice and be able to determine precisely the level of life to be granted to each and every body and individual. This will be an entirely new form of existence, unlike anything in this world. We're not really going to be talking about this much more tonight, and maybe it deserves a separate conversation. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll make this one of our 26 presentations. We'll talk about Yemos HaMashiach, Tchias HaMesim. But I just want you to see how the Ramban breaks down essentially what he says is Gischar Hanafashas V'Kiyuma B'Olam Hanashamas Nikra L'Rabbeinu Gan Eden. That's what Chazal call Gan Eden. And then is Yemos HaMashiach, and that is part of this world. U'B'Sofu Yom Adin Tchias HaMesim. So the Ramban sort of breaks it down into these different stages and phases. What exactly happens in the world to come? So one idea that we know, which is, again, maybe should be self-evident, but we take nothing for granted tonight, is that there is a great spiritual enjoyment, a pleasure, a delight in the world to come. The Nevi'im speak about it to the extent that we associate their words with Olam Haba, and Chazal are very explicit about this. The Gemara in Maseches Brachos, Daf Yud Zayin, which tells us that Rav used to say, "Lo kol olam hazeh olam haba." Olam hazeh and olam haba, they are very, very different. Olam haba ein bo lo achila v'lo shtia. He says no eating, there's no drinking. V'lo piri v'rivya, there's no having children. V'lo masu matan, there's no business dealings. V'lo kina, v'lo sin, v'lo tachrus. The things that we get caught up in this world, the pettiness, the jealousy, the anger, the competition. El tzadikim yoshvin, what we find is righteous ones literally sitting. So we could understand literally, maybe it just means a sort of in a state of great, of rest, of what we say maybe Yishuv Adas, V'atoseim Harashayim. They have crowns on their heads, V'nenim Ziv HaShechina. Describing over here, enjoying the Ziv HaShechina, the glow, the radiance of the divine presence. Another fairly famous Gemara at the end of Maseches Tanis, Amar Ula Bira, Amar Abelazar, Asar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lasas Mochel at Tzadikim, that in the future there will be a circle that is described over here for the righteous ones. V'yoshe b'neim b'gan Eden, he will sit in the middle, b'gan Eden, v'chol echad v'echad bar be'etzbo. So Chazal are describing over here something which we can't really understand, we can't relate to it in any physical sense. Nobody here has experienced this, but there seem to be describing something which is a state of great transcendence and great joy and happiness and pleasure and elation for the soul. Rav Dessler in the Sefer Michtav Ben Eliyahu, and I'm reading now from the English translation, Strive for Truth, says upon entering the state known as the world to come, the tzaddik begins to enjoy the splendor of the Shechina. Again, that's that idea of being enemies of Shechina. God raises, so to speak, a corner of the curtain, and the tzaddik experiences a little of God's greatness, of his overwhelming, many-faceted love for his creatures. He gets an inkling of the majestic universal plan which God has for all of his creatures and derives unimaginable joy from the realization that his struggle with his Yetzer Hara in his previous state has significantly contributed to the fulfillment of that plan. His soul is suffused with unutterable delight. So it's amazing. He's saying that a person comes to the next world and realizes that so many of the struggles that he experienced in this world were formative. They shaped who he is and enabled him to come to this point where he is right now. And another thing, says Rav Dessler, the very fact that he is granted such revelations, the very fact that he is privileged to experience so much pleasure must mean that his past efforts are appreciated. This person realizes that all of the challenges that he experienced in this world were purposeful. To know that God, whom he served, is pleased with him adds immeasurably to his satisfaction, which tells us something. Chazal are telling us that Olam Haba is not a place where there's a complete detachment from this world. The person comes to the next world and they discover something new and they completely forget and have no connection to their existence in this world in Olam Hazeh where we are right now. We see that that's not so. That there is a certain understanding. I don't know that there could be a complete and total understanding of all the mysteries of. It's hard to say that, because even when we go to Olam Haba, there's still a limit as to how much we can understand. We can't truly know all of the ways of Hashem, but there is much more clarity. There's much more revelation, and we have an understanding and appreciation which gives us great joy and great delight. What is the purpose of Olam Haba? What is the goal of it all? Why is it there? So there are several different things that we can highlight, and we should look at these each sort of independently as being purposes, goals, objectives for the existence of Olam Haba. Number one, and maybe this is the most obvious of all, it is a place where the righteous tzaddikim are rewarded. right? There's no shortage of examples for this. And I think that most often when we speak about Olam Haba, this is what we think. We say, schar mitzvah b'hayam aleka. There's no schar mitzvahs in this world. Wait till the next world. The pasuk tells us in Parshas Ekev, "V'shemarta as a mitzvah of zechugim es mishpatim asher anachim mitzavcha hayom la'asosam." The Torah says that you should guard, you should keep the mitzvahs of the Torah. Hayom la'asosam. Rashi says over there, hayom la'asosam ulamachar ulamaba litos charam. In other words, hayom, today in this world, we do. Meaning the purpose at Olam Haba is to be able to reap the benefits of that which we do in this world. This world is a world in which we do. The world to come is a world in which we derive benefit. I remember once seeing, I think I saw this in the parish of L'chsam Sofer on Chumash. L'chsam Sofer asks a very interesting question. He says, the Torah tells us that we have to pay our workers on time. We're not going to get into the particulars of this right now, but certainly for a day worker, for a person who, let's say, provides a certain service, and there's an understanding that it's going to be paid when the job is completed, you have to pay him right away. You can't go ahead and say, well, I don't have any money, come back to me a few days, in a week. No, that's an isser of withholding wages. So the Chazam Sofer says, well, if you have to pay a worker on time, so how could it be that God doesn't pay us on time? After all, every day I do lots of mitzvahs. I go to sleep at night. He doesn't pay me, right? That's what Chazal tell us. Char mitzvah b'hayam aleka. Next day, I get up, do more mitzvahs. He doesn't pay me. What's going on over here? Doesn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu model for us? Aren't we told v'alachta b'drachav we should follow in the ways of Hashem? So I could say God doesn't pay his workers on time. Why should I pay my workers on time? The Chasam Sofer says, no, God does pay his workers on time. The job is over when we leave this world. The job isn't over when I leave shul. The job isn't over when I go to sleep at night. Of course, those are what we call maybe, lunch breaks. Those are points of time in which we say, boss, I'm taking a break right now. I'm going to sleep for a little bit. I'll see you later. I'll see you tomorrow. But the job isn't over. So says the Chasam Sofer, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does pay us when the job is over. And the job is over when we leave this world. So Rashi says, Hayom la'asosam ulamachar l'olam litol scharim. This is something the Ramchal and Derech Hashem speaks about a lot as well. And he says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu specifically separated the time that we are supposed to work, the time of the avoda, in order to achieve shleimus from the period of kibbutz schar. And he did this in order to give us the possibility of earning a compounded effect of a lifetime full of masan tovim, something that can generate a schar, which is something that could be truly rewarding, something which would have much greater, if not eternal, value. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, as we would expect, in the 8th chapter, tells us very clearly, Hatov atzvunu l'sadikim hichai Ulamaba. You want to know where's the goodness that awaits tzadikim? Chaye ha'olamaba. This is what we mean when we say the world to come. Vehem ha'chaim she'eni maves. That is the life in which there is no death. Hatov she'eni ra'ah. There's a goodness which has no element of bad. We can't say that about this world. This is a world that does have maves, and this is a world where there's a constant confusion and an overlap, and sometimes a mixture between tov and what appears to be ra. But not so in the Olam Haba. Olam Haba, which is, again, a completely different mode of existence. Now, one word that I haven't mentioned at all yet tonight is a word that nobody really likes hearing, but of course it's part of the story of the world to come, and that is what we sometimes call Gehenna. Not going to talk right now about where that word comes from and what it actually may mean in terms of the etymology of the world, but we understand that we can appreciate that we speak about a place where there is, number one, accountability and a certain purification that has to take place. Now, I want to highlight what that means. If the world to come, if Olam Haba is a place that we go in order to be able to earn the benefits, to reap the benefits of all of the good things that we did in this world. So sometimes, in order to be able to access that, there needs to be a cleansing process, a spiritual cleansing process that prepares the soul for entrance to the world to come. This period of time is limited. That's why Chazal tell us that a person's soul cannot be in Gehenna for more than 12 months. That's a tradition that we have, and that's actually the reason why a person traditionally will say Kaddish for a parent for 11 months. Because if I say for the whole 12 months, it's the impression I have, or maybe the message I'm sending is, my father, my mother, they must have been, really terrible. Here I'm saying Kaddish in order to be matzel them from Gehenna for 12 months. So we do it for 11 months. Not everybody, but, that's the fairly common custom in our community, 11 months. So Gehenna is this spiritual cleansing process, which again is there not to punish us, but to ensure maximum appreciation and attendance in Olam Haba, in the world to come. Again, this is something that the Ramchal explains. And what's really interesting about the way he presents it is that we think about Gehenna as being a place which is, which is designed to get us, the punishment. This is what the punishment. This is where God takes all of his wrath and anger out on us. To the contrary, the existence of Gehenna itself is a reflection of God's goodness. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us a Gehenna so that the soul could be purified, so that it could fully access and appreciate and reap the benefits of Olam Haba, which is, he says, the Schar Amiti. So in other words, if we wouldn't have Gehenna, we wouldn't be able to fully appreciate Olam Haba, which would be a net loss to us. I remember, I've actually been thinking about this a lot over the past few weeks. When I was a teenager, I became exposed for the first time to the writings of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. I wasn't a big reader when I was a teenager, and I probably read, a lot more Stephen King, you'll forgive me, than I did Aryeh Kaplan. But Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan books were very popular at the time, and I'm very grateful that there were individuals, a couple of NCSY advisors, if I remember correctly, in particular, who shared a couple of books with me. And recently there has been much renewed discussion about Rabbi Kaplan, who died, I think, at the age of 48 in the early 1980s. Incredibly accomplished individual who was an MIT physicist and a great Torah scholar, who was able to, number one, translate some very, very difficult and challenging texts in Kabbalah, and even the Torah itself. He translated the Torah. There's a famous translation called the Living Torah, which is a remarkable translation of Chumash, which makes it very, very, very accessible to everyone. Really, really was a trailblazer in that regard. But he also had some very, very profound books. Most of them were very small and very dense, because almost every sentence refers to one or two Mamari Chazal, but he was able to weave it together in a way that was accessible to everyone. I want to read one passage from the book called If You Were God. This is a small book, it maybe 30 pages or so. I have one here in my house. If You Were God. And first of all, If You Were God is fascinating because it actually begins with a little bit of a challenge. The name of the book, If You Were God, and says, a lot of people say, yeah, if I were God. So he begins with this challenge of sorts. If you were God, and he basically gives you an objective. Okay, you're in charge of an island, and here's what you can do, and here are your powers, and here are your limitations, and here are your objectives. And it's a thought experiment, but he tries to get the person to realize, it's not so easy being God. I think, if I were God, I would just snap my fingers and make everybody's problems go away. But if I did that, then I wouldn't necessarily be able to truly afford humanity all that I want to give humanity. So not for now. But one thing that Rabbi Kaplan says in that book, I'm reading it to you. Imagine standing completely visible before God with your memory wide open, completely transparent without any jamming mechanism or reducing valve to diminish its force. You will remember everything you did and see it in a new light. You will see it in the light of the unshaded spirit, or if you will, in God's own light that shines from one end of creation to the other. The memory of every good deed and mitzvah will be the sublimest of pleasures, as our tradition speaks of Olam Haba. But your memory will also be open to all of the things which you are ashamed. They cannot be rationalized away or dismissed. You will be facing yourself fully aware of the consequences of all of your deeds. We all know the terrible shame and humiliation experienced when one is caught in the act of doing something wrong. Imagine being caught by one's own memory with no place to escape. This indeed may be what Daniel is alluding to when he says, in the 12th chapter of Sefer Daniel, and many of them that sleep in the dust shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to reproach and everlasting shame. So Rabbi Kaplan, again, describing in a very fascinating way what Gehenna is, and again, this is only one excerpt, but he talks about it more. It's literally sort of the lifting the veil, where a person has to sort of come to terms with his own actions and inactions in this world. One of the great chasadim, it's a double-edged sword, but one of the great kindnesses of God is that he created us with the koach hashichacha, the ability to forget, so we can forget about things that pain us, including things that we did that of which we are ashamed. And that really is a kindness, because that allows us to move forward and move on. But there is a point in time where we need to sort of come to terms with that. We need to confront it, and we need to see it for what it is. That process, says Rabbi Kaplan, that is Gehenna. Gehenna is not pitchforks and standing in fiery dungeons, in these big, vats full of lava. I don't know. See how good I am at describing Gehenna. That's not what Gehenna is. Gehenna is realizing, coming to this place where a person realizes what I've done and not being able to escape that, and sort of coming to terms with that and seeing for what it is. Now, another interesting thing that Chazal tell us about Olam Haba is that it is not, it is sort of a natural consequence of our actions, right? We shouldn't see Olam Haba as being a place where we go, when we leave this world, as being, our Olam Haba is sort of shaped and defined by our actions themselves. So, for example, the Meiri writes, in Olam Haba, schar hamasim, Olam Haba is not the reward for deeds, alu parim, rather, he says it's like the fruits. It's sort of the natural consequence. A tree bears fruit. My action in this world brings forth what we call Olam Haba. That is what follows. The Nefesh HaChaim says this in a most remarkable way. He says, Chazal tell us, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek li Olam Haba. He says, why do you say chelek li Olam Haba? Shouldn't it say Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek bit Olam Haba? It's a good question. You say every Jew, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek bit Olam Haba. So he says the reason it doesn't say bit Olam Haba, that would imply that there is this place called Olam Haba, and it's there, and we just sort of do what we do in this world, and then we get to that place. And as if it's like a separate entity. We do something here to go there. But he writes of emesh Olam Haba, hu masa yedei adam atzmo. Olam Haba is the product of a person's actions. When I act a certain way in this world, it creates this reality, a reality that I can't perceive when I'm in this world, but it is being built and created and constructed. That's why Chazal tell us, Chazal tell us that a person yeshem chelek le olam haba means a person chelek of the olam haba that he created, So there is that idea again that there is sort of a very, very strong and important connection between our experiences in this world, what we do in this world, and what we experience in the next world. Chazal actually tell us, this is very remarkable, that even some of the, maybe we'll say more trivial, I don't want to say petty, but the things that we value, the things that we think about when we are in this world, continue to occupy our minds and our thoughts in the next world. So, for example, the Gemara in Brachos, that Yud Chesem Beis tells us, is strange behavior. I wouldn't recommend doing this. Was a person who decided to sleep one night in the cemetery in order to see what goes on there and see what he would hear. So apparently he heard two spirits. He heard the spirits of, sounds like two women who were talking one to the other. So one said to her friend, hey, she said, come, let's listen what's going on, me'achorei pargod, which means like on the other side of the curtain, which probably means a reference to this world. Let's see what's going on down there. Let's see what's going on in our neighborhood. It's been whatever it is, several days, weeks, months, years since we left. Let's see what's going on. And this other soul responded, Eini yechole, I can't join you, shani kvura b'machzela shel kinim, because I was buried, basically she's saying like in a matting of reeds. In other words, she says, I'm not dressed appropriately. I can't go ahead and walk around out there. She says, L'chiat, go, and umat shuma, somebody tell me what you hear. So the way Rav Dessler explains this is that here you have the soul of an individual who had certain sensitivities when she was in this world. She was very makpedes on the way she would appear, about maybe she was, as we would say, perhaps very tsanua, and she was sensitive to that, even la'achar misa. It's hard to really understand what these mean, because it's not clear that Chazal are even telling this to be understood in the most literal sense. It's not that we're going to see lahavli, forgive me, like zombies walking around the street. I don't think that's the point over here. But in other words, the Chazal are telling us that the souls do retain a certain awareness and a certain connection to the thoughts, the spirits, the emotions, the values of how they lived in this world. Even perhaps I would say more fundamentally than everything that we've said until now, Olam Haba, to a certain extent, reflects the very purpose of creation. Right? On Shabbos, we say, on Friday night when davening, in the bracha in Shmon Esrei of Kedushas Hayom, we describe Shabbos as being tachlis masei shemayim v'aretz. I don't know if you ever thought about that. It's a very strange thing. Shabbos is the tachlis, the purpose of Brias Olam. The reason that's a little strange is because usually you think of Shabbos, what do we often call Shabbos? The day of rest. Shabbos is the day in which we rest so that we can have 6 productive days of work, right? For 6 days you work hard, and then the 7th day you got to take a break, you got to pause, you got to rest, and then you get back to work. So if you would ask somebody, what is the purpose of this world? Most people say the purpose of the world is to work, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us a day of Shabbos in between so we can just catch our breath and make sure to focus on the things in the world that are most important. But that's not what we say on that. When we say Shabbos is Tachlis Maseh Shemayim V'Aretz, it's almost as if the other way around. 6 days of work are there so that we can prepare for Shabbos. When you think about it, in the davening as well, we refer to Yom Shekula Shabbos, that the Olam Haba is a Yom Shekula Shabbos. Just think about that same idea over here. Is the purpose of creation the prosdar? Is it this lobby, the antechamber, or is it the traklin? Or is it the banquet hall that follows? So again, in Pirkei Avos it tells us, Olam hazeh damal prosdar b'fnei Olam haba. Haskein atzmucha, prepare yourself so that you can go into the traklin. And then in the very same Mishnah, it goes on to say, the next Mishnah, Hu haya omer, the same Tana, Rabbi Yaakov would say, Yafa sha'achas b'tshuv masam tovim b'olam hazeh, v'kol chayei olam haba. He said, 1 moment, 1 hour of tshuva and masan tova in this world is more precious, is greater than Olam Haba. Well, doesn't it sound like a contradiction of sorts? First, he says, Olam hazeh damal prosda. This world is like a prosda. It's like the lobby before the main banquet hall. And then he says, anything in this world, sha'achas of tshuva masan tovim, is greater than kol chayim haba. So, which one is it? These statements seem to contradict each other. But they're not contradicting each other at all. The purpose in creation was to give each and every one of us the ultimate good. And goodness is the closeness to God, which can only be experienced in the world to come. And so in that regard, we say that this world is secondary. This world is the tafel. This world is the prosdar. The world to come is the ikar. But in order for that to actually become the greatest possible good, this closeness to God must be earned. It's not something that's handed over, right? As Chazal quote, I think it's the Zohar, the concept of Nama de Kisufa, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu just gives handouts. If he did that, we wouldn't appreciate it. We know in this world, we know from our own experience, when you work hard for something, you earn it, it's so much more meaningful than when someone just gives you a handout. So life in this world is an opportunity for earning the true good of Olam Haba. So that's why it says, Yafa sha'achas. If you have a shachas in this world of tshuva masam tovim, that could be amazing. That could be, revolutionary in terms of what that could offer you, what that could allow you in the Olam Haba. There's a famous story that they tell about the Vilna Gaon, that at the end of his life, he was, in his last moments of life, and his Talmidim were gathered around his bed. And, as Chazal tell us, many stories like this, the Talmidim want to hear the last words from the Rebbe. So in this story that they tell about the Vilna Gaon, his last hours of life, they said to him, and they were, just sitting with him to see how he was experiencing this moment, what he was saying. And they were very surprised to see that he had tears on his face. Why does he have tears on his face? Doesn't Vilna Gaon realize he lived a life which is completely devoted to Torah, to Masam Tovim? And the way the story goes, that he holds up his tzitzis, and he says, how beautiful this world is. For just a few pennies, what does it cost to buy a pair of tzitzis? You can buy threads and make tzitzis, and you can come so close to the Shekhinah. But in the world to come, it's impossible to do any of this. That's the idea of Yafa Sha'achas. He wasn't saying that, it's all downhill from here. He wasn't saying, he wasn't crying because he's going to get to Olam Haba, which is going to be a place of pain and misery. No, the Vilna Gaon realized that the ikar, the primary mode of existence, is in the next world. But he also realized that I wanted to have more opportunities here, to chaparayim, to grab a little more, to make sure that when I get to that place, it will be the most meaningful, enriching experience possible. So the last question I want to discuss tonight, before concluding, even though, like I said, and I'll remind everybody right now, we're really, really, really just scratching the surface. We're always just scratching the surface, but especially here we're talking about such a big topic, such a broad topic, one that in many ways is sort of hidden from us, very esoteric, very difficult to really connect to. Why is there no explicit mention of Olam Haba in the Torah? We started off tonight by talking about references that we find in Tanakh and Chazal, but wouldn't you think that something that is so central to our existence, something that we see that is such the cornerstone of Torah, something which is the purpose of creation, wouldn't you think that that would be more explicit in the Torah? Why do we find that the Torah is essentially silent on this issue? And again, references here and there for the most part, the Torah doesn't say anything. So I'd like to share several answers with you. Much of what I shared with you tonight, by the way, I want to acknowledge and to thank, comes from a beautiful. It's actually I took some sources from multiple source sheets that are found on the Olami website. Olami is a wonderful organization that has many resources there, and there have been, I don't know, I think 3 or 4 or 5 very lengthy source sheets with a wealth of marmakomos on many topics, but on the topic of Olam Haba and Mashiach, and I found it extremely helpful in terms of preparing for tonight. So over here, I think that there are 4, 5 answers or suggestions, we could say rather, as to why it is that Olam Haba is something which is not found explicitly in the Torah. So the first one is that it's so obvious. There's a basic principle that the Gemara teaches, that something which is so obvious doesn't need to be said, right? Chazal say, Lama likras svari. Why do you need a pasuk to tell me something that's completely obvious? What's so obvious? So Rav Sadia Gaon in the Sefer Munas Videos basically says that logic dictates that there is a world, that there is a reward to come, that there was a reward rather to follow in the world to come. It would be illogical to assume that we are just here to work and to do and to exist, and then we seek to exist. Obviously, this logic presupposes that a person has basic beliefs in the existence of God. A person doesn't, I suppose a person is a complete atheist, to the extent that a person can be a complete atheist, say, well, I reject everything, the entire notion of a spiritual world, that, we are here merely because, we have become very sophisticated, evolved species, which have come about through a lot of random mutations, obviously not driven or facilitated by the intelligent, perfect creator. So then I suppose for such an individual, maybe it's not so illogical. But for everyone else who says, yeah, I believe that God created me, I believe that the world is just too complex and too beautiful to dismiss it as all being chance. So I realize that there's a creator. I believe in the Torah. I believe in the concept of Torah Misinai. I believe in national revelation. So I believe in all these things. So then it really is like really illogical to say all of that, and then it just ends. It ceases to exist. So again, I find this compelling, but just because I do doesn't mean you do. But that's one reason that is suggested. Another thing is that if the Torah would attempt to describe Olam Haba, it inevitably would require a great reduction and trivializing ideas and concepts which are very deep and very sublime. Chazal tell us this, that Kol HaNeviim Kulan Lo Nisnadnu Ali Moshe Mashiach, that the Nevi'im only prophesies about Moshe Mashiach, but not Olam Haba. Because, as the pasuk in Yeshayahu says, Ayin LaRasa Elohim Zulasecha. Only God could see this. So the Nevi'im themselves, the prophets themselves, said, we don't understand this. So they didn't even try. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva writes as well that there's no point in trying to understand Olam Haba. Olam Haba, he says, is something that's completely beyond our grasp. We don't have the ability to describe. We don't have the words. We don't have the vocabulary. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. A cynic may say, well, if you can't describe it, it doesn't exist. But of course, that's not logical. That would be, Mashal Amad Davadoma, that would be like a person who, God forbid, is blind and was never able to see. A person was born without eyesight. And you were tasked with having to explain to that person what the color red means. What does the color red mean? Explain red, blue, green. And you do whatever you can. Use all the words you want. Here's the dictionary. Can you explain the color red, blue, green, yellow, any color for that matter to a person who's blind? The answer is no. You can't. There are no words in the human vocabulary which describe a color. It requires having a sense. And if you don't have that sense, well then, You can't describe it. Does that mean the colors don't exist? Of course, colors exist. We know colors exist. We all see colors all the time. So what does that tell you? Just because you can't describe something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But there are certain senses that are needed in order to see certain things. There are insects we know that can see shades and colors and can different shade of shades of light across the light spectrum that we can't see. We know that they exist. Insects can see it and we can't see it. So we can't see everything. We cannot perceive every sound. We cannot perceive and sense everything that could be possibly visible through sight. And of course, there are many other senses that we don't even possess. And so therefore, the reason perhaps why Torah and Chazal speak very, very little about Olam Haba is because there is nothing that can be said. We are physical beings. We have a spiritual side. We have a spiritual capacity, but you can't really explain it. And you know what happens? You see the disastrous results when you try to oversimplify things like Olam Haba. You end up with metaphors, which are, think about some of the popular Western notions of heaven and hell, some of which I tried before. Think about angels that are strumming harps and devils with pitchforks. I mean, this is the best we can do, but that's not Olam Haba. And so therefore, you see what happens when we try to take something which is so profound, something which is so sublime, and try to explain it. We end up reducing it and trivializing so much that just forget it. Just forget it. Don't even bother. There's another reason why the Torah perhaps doesn't highlight and really speak much at Olam Haba, and that is because that should not be our motivation. Despite everything we said tonight, the Torah does not mention Olam Haba because we're not supposed to keep Torah mitzvos for the sake of receiving reward. We are told that we will, but we are not supposed to do it for that reason, right? Another very famous Mishnah Pirkei Avos in the first parak that we're taught, don't be like those servants who go to work and serve their master just so they get a reward. No, rather you should be like those who do it for the right reasons. Because I'm a Yari Shemayim, because I'm a God-fearing person, and this is what God told me to do, and that's why I do it. And had the Torah mentioned Olam Haba more than perhaps a veiled reference here and there, it would give us the impression that this is why. The Torah is constantly dangling the currency before our eyes and saying, ooh, so we know that we do this sometimes when we want to motivate children, let's say, to do the right thing. We'll sometimes bribe them, give them treats. Okay, maybe there's a time and place for that sort of things. But as adults, when we become sophisticated adults who are given the ability, the capacity to use free choice, and we are tries to make decisions, it can't always be about what am I going to get? What am I going to get? And so therefore, it could very well be that the reason why the Torah does not mention really the concept of Olam Haba, other than, again, a reference here and there, is so as to not put us in a position where we think that this is really all about what am I going to get. And finally, there is an idea that the Maharal says, and he teaches in Tiferes Yisrael, that the Torah does not share ideas or convey ideas that could be, that cannot really be proven, so to speak, just by way of our observation. If theory is deemed unscientific if it is not falsifiable, right? That a theory has to be compatible with possible observations. Otherwise, if there's no way to construct an experiment which you could either prove or disprove the truth of a theory, so then it's, it can't, it remains just that, a theory. So Jewish philosophers have argued that promising a reward that no one could ever verify does not lend credence to the Torah. The Maharal basically says that the Torah does not want to do that. It is only fitting. He said it's only fitting that the words of the Torah be clear and recognizable. L'chush ayin, he says, literally to the eye, but not that a person should, erroneously compare Judaism to another religion, and promises are made, and then people start to doubt, and people think. If you think, I'd rather not give examples, but if you think about how other religions, they promise things that may sound to us and others to be completely absurd. If you do this, if you die, if you die in a case of martyrdom, so here's what your reward is going to be. So when you emphasize that, you put people in a position where they're going to doubt, they're going to question whether this is even true, because it's not really something that could be proven. And the Maharal seems to be implying and suggesting that when we live a Torah life, when we follow the ways of the Torah, the truth of the Torah sort of proves itself by living a Torah life. It's something which is motivating. It is something which gives us meaning and purpose. Not to say that everything we can understand fully and appreciate, no, but it is something which is energizing. It's something which gives us a sense of purpose and focus and direction. And that is something which can be proven, meaning I can prove to you, I'm happier with it than without it. There are many, many studies that show that people who are spiritually minded in general, because of connections to community and because of their ability to be resilient in different situations and turn their faith to God, there are many, many reasons for it. But that's sort of evident, it's self-evident, it's something that can be proven. If we're going to talk constantly, if the Torah is going to talk about Olam, Haba, Olam, and it's all about trust me. So it says the Maharal, that's not the style of the Torah. So because of the fact that the concept of Olam Haba is something that really can't be proven, there are no scientific methods, if you will, that can be used to make it seem relevant or proven to us. So therefore, the Torah doesn't attempt to really talk about it much, other than references here and there. So there was like I said, a very brief, but hopefully a meaningful overview. What do we actually know about Olam Haba? We actually know a lot more than we just shared tonight, but in 50 minutes or so, that's what we actually know about Olam Haba. I'm hoping to be able to give a shir next week. It turns out that I may have a difficult time doing it next week, but stay tuned. Just however you would follow the news and know whether or not I'm giving a shir next week, I'm going to make every effort to do so. I think the next topic on our agenda is about Zmira Shabbos. Worst case scenario, if I can't give it next week, so we'll continue the following week. But I'm hoping next Tuesday, same time, to be able to see you here for a special shir. Have a wonderful night, and thank you so much for joining us.